Earlier this year, I published a report focusing on the enigmatic Nintendo game best known to the public as Project H.A.M.M.E.R. Since that video went live, I've since been fortunate enough to receive even more information from former associates of Nintendo software technology. In this follow-up video, I will be revisiting the subject to share a new dose of insights from its development. The project, as we know, entered pre-production in late 2003 following the completion of 1080 Avalanche. The original concept behind H.A.M.M.E.R, however, differs somewhat from the version seen at E3 2006. When it began, it was being made with the intention of filling a perceived gap in Nintendo's portfolio, the hack-and-slash genre. At the time, the game was being likened to one series in particular, and that was Dynasty Warriors. NST was touting it as a Western twist on Dynasty Warriors, not officially of course, but as their own take on the formula. They intended to produce a title in which players would battle through large crowds of enemies, with the occasional fight against another similarly matched warrior to the protagonist. Their Western twist on the setup was mostly visual and story-based, such as the idea of brawling with an army of robots. On that note, how Project H.A.M.M.E.R's initial conception came about has been described by former workers as a very atypical process for a Nintendo game, as well as one of its earliest mistakes. It's common practice for first-party studios to develop titles such as this with gameplay as a #1 priority. H.A.M.M.E.R, or to call it by its true working title, Machine X, made for an exception to this. In its earlier days, that vague idea of a Dynasty Warriors style approach was more or less all they had in relation to how the game would actually handle. In an uncharacteristic move for an NST team, the story and world building around it were the first aspects of the project to be worked on, ahead of all else. One former designer described the plot to me in very negative terms to say the least, comparing it to a bad fanfiction, and said, "It's a key example of how not to make games. Don't start with story and art before the core element of fun is down." I revealed a handful of details about how the story would have played out in the original video, but let's delve in deeper. M09, the protagonist, was a hammer-wielding android who would have fought alongside the US government in their struggle against an invading force of robots. What's more is that M09's creation would have preceded the start of the conflict that the game focuses on, and it would have been revealed that he was originally made by the game's villains as a weapon of war. The enemy faction in Machine X has been described to me by former NST members as Nintendo's very own Umbrella Corporation, a faceless conglomerate with quietly malicious intentions. It's led by an evil scientist, the man responsible for bringing M09 to life, whose body is fused with robotics from an experiment gone awry and can attack with giant tentacles of metal. In the events leading up to the campaign, the government rescues M09 from a facility belonging to this opposing force. Unable to identify any practical use for him on the battlefield, they repurpose him into assisting the police force in New Chicago, the game's near-future version of the Illinois city, and the setting of the first level. The campaign would have essentially been structured like a tour of various US states, beginning in the city of New Chicago before heading to a war-torn Washington DC, San Francisco, Seattle, and others. At each new destination, M09 would have fought a fellow android with unique powers. One developer compared this element of the premise to Mega Man. Each would have been titled under the same naming convention as M09, as in M10, M11, M12, etc. Eventually, after defeating 6 other bosses, the story mode would have climaxed with a destructive face-off between the protagonist and his tentacled maker, although the majority of this only ever existed on paper. Only one of the 7 planned boss battles was ever worked on to any great extent. The game would have used entirely CGI cutscenes for its narrative. As mentioned previously, Silver Ant, a third-party animation studio, was hired by Nintendo Software Technology to produce them. The cinematics, lasting a combined total of just over 5 minutes, were funded and completed very early into development, as far back as before its first public showing in 2006. This seemingly insignificant event later proved to be one of the defining missteps in Project H.A.M.M.E.R's lifecycle. When development began to experience troubles, and there were considerations for simply shutting it down, NST's management was understandably reluctant due to the large financial investment that the company company had already made into CGI. Associates of Silverant and NST say that the total amount spent on it was in excess of $1 million. This placed the company in a very difficult situation. It was a matter of either cancelling, wasting a huge amount of money, or continuing on and trying to salvage something. To save costs, voice acting for characters was never recorded by specially hired professionals. As an alternative, each role was played by NST workers themselves. When I inquired who among them lent their voice to the protagonist, I was told that M09 was in fact going to be completely mute. One developer spoke to me about the dialogue heard throughout the story. There was this terrible line that always sticks with me. After a cop sees M09 in action, he says, "Nice hammer, man." When asked about how the source felt about M09 as a character, they replied, "He was part man, part machine, all mediocre." One very minor yet enduring question that has gone unanswered since Project H.A.M.M.E.R was first introduced to the public is the matter of its namesake. The official logo, as many have pointed out to me, is stylized with bullet points between each letter of the word hammer, suggesting that it might have been an acronym of 6 separate words. In actuality, Project H.A.M.M.E.R gets its codename from the in-game narrative, as the government operation to bring M09 into combat is called just that. The periods between each character in the word hammer was nothing more than a small stylistic choice to make an interesting tentative title. It didn't really stand for anything. In September 2006, as development on the project struggled on, NST had just completed another game, Mario vs Donkey Kong 2 March of the Minis. This was another title that the company had outsourced a reasonably large amount of cutscenes to Silverant for, and another contract costing Nintendo somewhere in the region of $1 million US. Certain members of NCL were less than pleased upon learning that so much of the funding had been used for this. During a visit to Kyoto shortly after March of the Minis launched, the individual responsible for budgetary management on both projects was reprimanded by none other than Shigeru Miyamoto himself. The legendary producer apparently condemned their investment into CGI as superfluous. This subsequently ended NST's relationship with Silverant. I reached out to the animation house to discuss the experience of working with Nintendo, but they weren't willing to comment. Shortly after the previous video was published, Silverant removed all references to their Nintendo projects from the work list on their official site, and any relevant photos from their Facebook page. Katsuhiko Kano was the director appointed to Project H.A.M.M.E.R at its inception. His previous credits included map design for Luigi's Mansion and lead artist on 1080 Avalanche. Machine X was to be his directorial debut. Kano was one of the primary figures that NST members alleged was the cause of so much tension between the team and the management. His allegedly brash and dismissive attitude towards Western developers forged a rift between the two. Whereas the designers would propose new ways to add substance to the game, Kano apparently refused to acknowledge what so many of his colleagues saw as an issue. The developers would openly criticize aspects such as the repetitiveness of the combat, but the company's management paid little attention. Numerous former workers recalled Kano as being difficult to work with, describing him as rude and uncooperative. Towards the end of Kano's turn at the helm of the project, a mass exodus occurred at Nintendo Software Technology. The conflict between managerial staff and the team had boiled to such a point that employees began to leave, firmly into double figures. Within the final years of H.A.M.M.E.R and what it eventually became, over half of the entire company's staff departed, shrinking it from around 55 workers to approximately 25. What exactly happened at the subsidiary extended beyond a mere creative disagreement, however. One ex-artist from the developer described what they called a culture of scapegoating. Anytime there was a failure, the people in the trenches were sacrificed in service of the higher-ups maintaining power and not losing face. Blame was placed on scapegoats, and it was a political nightmare for those who were just there to be creative and make great games. According to the testimonies of multiple former developers, Jason Behr was among those who were wrongfully held accountable as the project fell into disrepair. Before his time at the company, Behr had made a name for himself as the lead level designer at Retro Studios on the original Metroid Prime. He joined Project H.A.M.M.E.R in 2006 as it began to fall short of expectations. The managerial staff are said to have placed a huge amount of pressure on him to rescue the game, despite the limited creative control he held in the position of creative designer. Jason stayed on until 2008, apparently struggling to work alongside Kano and his other superiors. After 2 years in the thick of it, he allegedly found himself singled out as one of the lone targets for blame as Machine X crashed and burned. After departing mid-development, Bear has since formed his own independent studio, Sunbreak Games. He was not available for comment. As the exodus continued, NST's higher-ups began to recognise the apparent friction between director Kano and his subordinates. Although Kano was never formally disciplined during the life cycle of H.A.M.M.E.R, they did eventually remove him from the project in mid-2007. His replacement was Masamichi Abe, the director of such titles as the first 2 Pikmin games, as well as Tekken 2. Towards the end of development on Machine X, Kensuke Tanabe, the producer of the Metroid Prime series, joined the project in a supervisory role. It's unknown exactly what impact Tanabe's involvement had during his limited time at NST, but by all accounts, it wasn't anything substantial. After visiting the site a few times, he apparently gave up hope and made his leave. The team, even under Masamichi Abe's direction, still faced tremendous adversity as the disagreements between developers and management went on. It's at this point that Project H.A.M.M.E.R, as the public best knows it, would be reborn. It was decided towards the end of 2007 that it would become more oriented towards casual audiences in the form of We Crush. The reasoning behind this was varied. Aside from simply the impression that a new visual style might make it more appealing in general, there were other factors at play, chief among which was that We Crush was essentially an attempt to shrink the production. After sinking millions into Machine X, if it was to continue, it would have to do so on a reduced budget and scale. Blending inspiration for a more basic art style from the enormously popular Wii Sports came as a natural progression in their endeavours to see the project bear fruit. As it dragged out into 2008, the framework of gameplay, as we've established before, was left untouched. We Crush, however, did at least try to tread its own path outside of the failings of its forerunner, as I've learned recently. The team began by adding 4-player local co-op and support for Mii's. The game essentially involved a very basic story in which alien robots were invading a town which was thematically similar to the one seen in Woohoo Island of Wii Sports Resort. The player, equipped again with a large hammer, would travel around the world destroying them. In spite of this movement to shake the project up, the developers found that it remained lackluster. The management still not allowing them to alter the core gameplay in any major way, a last-ditch effort was made to save matters in the closing months of development. This was the addition of support for Wii Motion Plus, adding a greater level of precision to controls. Although, as one ex-worker put it, accuracy was not the issue. In 2009, the project came to an end. All attempts to rescue it had been unsuccessful, even the introduction of new blood at the helm. H.A.M.M.E.R in the end had cost NST over half of its workforce and a lot of NCL's trust. If we weren't a first party, we'd likely have been shut down, another developer added. Sources claim that Katsuhiko Kano, the original director of H.A.M.M.E.R, was removed from NST after development on a Mario Clock application for the DSi platform. With yet more arguments breaking out between him and staffers during that undertaking, NCL gave him an ultimatum. In recognition of the recurring issues resulting from him working alongside American developers, he was told to either migrate to work at a branch in Japan or leave Nintendo altogether. He took the former option. The day-to-day operations at the company would largely go unchanged, and the success of such games as Mario and Donkey Kong Miniland Mayhem is said to have helped hugely in their favour. With that said, as the subsidiary considers a radical change in direction, the likelihood of them ever again producing a large-scale console project gets smaller as time goes on.